Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we continue our series with contributors to the book, The German-Soviet War, links in the description below, with a look at Stalingrad, presented by Dr. Ian Garner. Ian will be talking about how the Soviets planned the city's reconstruction, kind of wider ideas and how it fits into Soviet society, etc., and how they use the fighting there to motivate a wider population. If you're new to the channel, please don't forget to click like and subscribe, and the information you need is always in that description below. But without further ado, I'll bring Ian in. Good evening, sir. How are you today?
Hi, folks. Very good. Excited to do this. So thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm glad you're here. So the thing about Stalingrad is, like any other of these massive, great kind of world-changing aspects of World War II, is they are, to say they're rabbit holes is an understatement. People have spent years and years just micro studying the individual battle side of things, but you've come at it from a different angle. So just before we kind of start the presentation proper, you've been looking at Stalingrad for sort of 15 years or so. What's been the real focus of your study?
So yeah, I started as a graduate student way back when in Toronto, and I was very interested in why it is that the Russians are so obsessed with this battle, right? Because having grown up in Britain, I was thinking, you know, we have this sort of myth of the Battle of Britain, maybe the Blitz, this idea of the Blitz spirit. This seems to be what's going on in Russia. And I was very naive. I was a callow young grad student. And so I spent a long time looking at the origins of the story of Stalingrad, where it came from, who wrote it, how they did it, where they went, down to tracking down notebooks in archives that people were writing down, the origins of phrases that crop up time and time again over the years, and even crop up today. And, you know, and I'm sure we've got plenty of time to get into this. Stalingrad still matters really for Russia and Russian politics today in a very active way, given that this is a country that is now involved in a war, an active war, or a war that is a war of invasion rather than defense. And so you name it, when it comes to sort of cultural representations of Stalingrad and what they mean for Russians, for Soviets, how the governments have used them, how ordinary people have shaped them, that's been my jam. And I spent a few years off of Stalingrad. And I'm actually really glad that this chapter came out when it did, and that you have me here today, because I've just got back into it and looking at representations of Stalingrad on social media and on Russian state-sponsored Telegram channels in particular. So I suspect I'm about to dive down another rabbit hole.
Well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that Battle of Britain comparison there, because in a sense there are two battles of Britain. There's the actual one that was fought in the skies and in 1940, and then there's that way that the British think about it and how it gets used and is continued to be used in politics and advertising and all those other aspects that we as Brits and further around the world understand what that means. But we're going to talk about Stalingrad. So you've come prepared with slides. So folks, you've kind of got the gist, I hope, from the introduction there, that we're talking about this greater vision of Stalingrad. So I'm going to hand over to Ian to take us through that. But of course, fire away with questions, and we will get to some of them, as many as we can, or we'll save them for the end. But I'm going to hand over to Ian to kind of take us through what we're talking about. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Well, you've done a very dangerous thing, Paul, by giving me a platform and a slide deck, and I'm a very digressive and excitable speaker. So, Paul, you can interrupt with questions as you go.
I will do.
You gave me a great word to kind of tee up what is happening here, and that is greater visions of Stalingrad. And I threw this picture on the first slide to give you a sense of what Stalingrad was always meant to be in the Soviet imagination. This was a never realized vision for this ludicrously grand palace of the Soviets. There was a big architectural competition in the 1930s to design this, because in the 30s, Stalingrad, and Stalingrad literally means Stalin city, was meant to be the model Soviet city. This was meant to be the place where Stalin won the Russian Civil War. He beat back the whites. It's all complete BS, the myth of what he actually did in the Civil War, but that was the story. And so it was supposed to be filled with sort of parks and wonderful things. Technology, industry was supposed to meet, and thus you get this absurd vision of what is basically a wedding cake with a massive statue of Lenin slammed on the top. They never built it, but you know, even in the bleakness of the 1930s, you can see that for the people that were looking at this sort of stuff, this could have been inspirational. right? So in 1942, when the Germans smash their way through into Stalingrad and spend four months basically completely destroying the city, and 1 million men and women, more or less, on each side die before the Soviets win the battle. Suddenly, this sort of dream city has been destroyed, right? And turned into complete smoking ruins. And so when the victory at Stalingrad happens, and we can talk more about this, Soviet writers and thinkers and ordinary people, as I show in my first book, Stalingrad Lives, all from all good bookstores.
Nice plug. Yeah, well done. Slickly done there.
Absolutely shameless plugs today. Although it's an academic book, so it's terribly expensive. But, you know, well worth it if you really have a dad or a friend that you would like to buy a present for. Or yourself, who knows. When this victory actually came at Stalingrad, and, you know, we're all military history fans to some extent here, we know how unexpected the victory was, right? The Soviets just didn't look like they were going to win at Stalingrad. Stalingrad is destroyed. The Soviet Union is going to fall. Within about 3 weeks after Operation Uranus, people are saying that Stalingrad is the birth of a new day. It's the birth of hope. And that word is really significant for what is happening around Stalingrad and what ordinary people are thinking. And it really is ordinary people. And I argue in this book that this is the first time that the state and ordinary Soviet people really have anything that they bond around since the early sort of revolutionary days. Suddenly, we have not death, not suffering, not pain, not the destruction of a city, but birth. It is this myth of rebirth, literally of resurrection. It gets pretty like kooky, out there, religious in the way that many people are writing about it and talking about it. The idea of resurrection. Stalingrad died, all those people at Stalingrad died in order to save us. Right? And that is very different from how we think about the war, where we think never again, right? We think we're very grateful that, you know, people died at D-Day, Juno Beach, if you're Canadian, you name it. But we wish it didn't have to happen. But here we get this Stalingrad story. We acknowledge that it had to happen. It's suffering, right? And this is, if you want to get really boring, Google Orthodox kenoticism, kenotic ideas in Orthodoxy, and you understand where this comes from. But I'm not going to go into it because it gets real theoretical real quick. And you want to see more pictures. So after the battle, they come back to this idea. Here are some more of these designs for the Palace of the Soviets in the 1930s. And you can see they're all pretty ludicrous, right? It's like
that sequence in the Spinal Tap when they're talking about the videos and album covers. It's like someone's taking this to 11. You know, it's how big is the column? No, bigger than that. No, really big. No, 5 levels. Can we make it 6? You know,
exactly, right. And I don't know. I'd actually be curious to look into how feasible any of these plans actually were. Could they have built something like the design in the middle here? I don't know. But, you know, this is the image. So after the war, after the battle, rather, and even as the fighting is just dying down in February 1943, because Paulus and the last Germans surrender in February 1943, February the 2nd. Someone's going to tell me that's the wrong date. I'm pretty sure it's the right date. I'm terrible at dates. I apologize, even after years of doing this. Even as this is happening, even as, you know, the city is still just covered in bodies and mines and ordnance, it's all battered apart. The local council and the government in Moscow is starting to hatch plans that we're going to do this again, right? We're going to turn this city into this sort of physical and metaphorical embodiment of birth after the war, which is really interesting, right? They don't wait until the forces are closing in on Berlin. You know, they're gambling on the fact that Stalingrad is the end of it, really. You know, Stalingrad is the glorious march to Berlin. And if you read that first book, Stalingrad Lives, you'll find all of these stories saying, you know, all of these very ordinary people just were inspired by this idea. People really did believe it.
Just a quick question for you, Ian. You know, when we made that comparison to the Battle of Britain, now the reality is most people in the United Kingdom had some direct connection with the Battle of Britain. Most people in the south of the country saw aircraft flying overhead. People up the north, there were still air forces flying over there. But Stalingrad, we forget how vast the Soviet Union is. So I'm assuming most people who are inspired by Stalingrad had never visited the city before, were never to visit it again. And everything they understood about it was from state-provided propaganda, I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Soviets during the war, in the first few weeks of the war, they attempted to use the newspapers to create interesting propaganda to sort of rally people around the national idea. But they tried to do it in this very sort of dry, procedural, sort of Marxist-Leninist tone that was familiar from the 1930s. And pretty quickly they realized nobody was reading the papers. The papers weren't being delivered. So what they did is they went out and they hired the very best fiction writers in the country and made them war reporters, and they embedded them with the army. And they were not like war reporters in the West, right? They really were in the army. They had ranks, right? And they were living in Stalingrad. People like Vasily Grossman, who was probably the most famous of them, but Konstantin Simonov as well, who was a great writer. Ilya Ehrenburg, very famous Jewish Soviet writer, didn't go to Stalingrad. He was a little behind the front, but many, many others, right? And they sent them away and they said, look, guys, no more censorship, right? You don't have to worry. Just write good stuff, write interesting stuff. And these guys by themselves came up with these sort of, what are quite good stories of ordinary people at war. They're very inspiring. And most of them are pretty close to being true. And I mentioned these notebooks, right? Earlier on that I found in archives. You can go back and you can find the interviews they did with ordinary soldiers. Because when you've got 1 million people fighting, you can find fascinating stories. And so throughout the early months of the war, they're building up this sort of system within the newspapers, and they're building up a system of getting the newspapers all the way across the country. And so you can go, and I've read letters from the Far East, from Vladivostok, which is almost as far as you can go in Russia, unless you're going to go out to like Magadan or Kamchatka. People who were there, who are reading about the exploits at Stalingrad, and then writing to each other and writing diaries and saying, this was phenomenal. I'm looking forward to the end of the war now. I can't wait. This is bringing me hope. And it's quite extraordinary, really.
So what you're sort of saying, and we're going to get to this later on, is that we refer to it as a turning point, but they kind of jumped the gun, no pun intended, and were kind of building on it based on the hope that this sort of valiant defense can be replicated and turned into an aggressive victory. But it is a turning point, but they're making it something else on a wider level.
A much grander turning point. And the way that Stalingrad is talked about, it's not just saving the Soviet Union. It's not just saving some Soviet citizens. They talk about it. This is the new Verdun. This is the new Carthage. This is the new Troy. This is going to save, and literally, this is going to save the world, save civilization, and save humanity. That's the way that the threat and the savior of the salvation from the threat of the Germans is phrased. And you will notice I say Germans. There are almost no Romanians or Italians involved in this, even though especially Romanians had quite a role to play at Stalingrad. It is all about the Germans. They are the Nazis. They are the threat in this propaganda world. Do you want to see some more pictures?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
So off they go, and they do reconstruct some stuff. So they build this Volga-Don canal, which has been basically a Russian dream since the 19th century, to create something that's going to link up the Volga and the Don. They start work on it very early. You can see on the right-hand side, it's still in operation. It's great for shipping. And it is sold as this great propaganda achievement. And in the months and the years after the battle ends, it is supposed to be this grand national epic where Soviets are supposed to be coming together and bonding, purportedly flooding into the city. And some people do write requests to their local Soviet in far-flung areas of the Soviet Union saying, I want to go to Stalingrad. I want to go and work on this sort of construction project. And you'll see, of course, they whacked a big statue of Stalin at the front. That's on the bottom right there. Now, how was it actually built? Yes, there were Soviets involved, regular people. There were German POWs, very few of whom got to go home after the war, and there were very many of them taken after Stalingrad. There was slave labor, there was gulag labor. So, the story that I'm talking about is not, by this point, uncensored. It is not very real. It's quite faked. But you can imagine, again, if you're somebody far away from the action, you don't really know what's happening in this information environment. Instead, you're able to see here in the pictures that are shared, in the news that is shared over the 7 or 8 years of the construction here, you're supposed to see this physical manifestation of what Stalingrad, of what war means. And to me, this is really interesting. When I was first learning about this, thinking back to before I started thinking about the Russian version of the story, I had in mind what's really the German version of Stalingrad, which is freezing troops dying in a pointless, senseless battle. Everybody starving to death. Soviets don't talk about that stage of the battle at all. Right? They're not very interested in that, what's happening in the cold winter. For them, it's November the 19th, when the counterattack happens, when they win the war, and when suddenly we get this birth of a new day. And they keep going. They build more stuff. Here's a Stalingrad Planetarium, and you can see, I thought of throwing a picture of the construction because I just think it's a fabulously interesting little picture. This was completed in 1954. So this is just after Stalingrad dies. But you can see how Stalingrad turns into a planetarium, and the planetarium is suddenly starting to come into play around sort of visions of the cosmos flying to space. And this is just the first inklings of the space race, right? So why pick out the planetarium? Well, Stalingrad isn't just being rebuilt how it was. It's being rebuilt bigger, better. It's sort of dragging us into the future. Thank God for that sacrifice. Thank God for the past. And then we get the one that everybody knows, right? The most emblematic image of Russian and Soviet war memory is this Motherland Calls monument. So this sits in Volgograd, Stalingrad itself. It takes them about 10 years to build it. Again, it's based on an open architectural competition. A guy called Vucetich wins that competition. And this is on top of the Maier of Kurgan, which is this hill, which is the scene of some of the bloodiest fighting in the battle itself, and it sort of changed hands back and forth between the Germans and the Soviets multiple times. If you want to read more about it, what it was like, then Grossman has done some excellent writing on it. Simonov has done excellent writing on it, but there was a guy called Viktor Nekrasov, who was a fabulously good writer who wrote a novel, In the Trenches of Stalingrad, it's usually translated out, which came out as 1946. At first very welcomed by the Soviet authorities, and then it got banned, and ultimately Nekrasov had to leave, and he was exiled to Paris and died in Paris in the 1980s. And he is a brilliant writer for capturing the spirit of what it is like to be an ordinary soldier in the war. And really interesting as well, because he's a native Ukrainian, and reading in light of the present, sort of trying to understand how he fits in as Ukrainian into the Soviet army is really interesting. So, the Motherland Calls is supposed to be sort of emblematic of the suffering, but also of this sort of flowering of the nation, because it's so big. And I believe when it's created, it is the tallest statue in the world. I'm like 98% certain that is correct. So,
you kind of imagine they would have wanted to have had that little accolade, wouldn't they? They would, if there was any chance of it being the biggest, you can't think they would have avoided that. They would have made sure. Yeah.
Put a few feet on the sword at the top, and
yeah.
And there are also films, and a lot of this stuff is encoded in films. And I didn't want to give you too many quotes from the stories and books that I've been looking at, because it gets a bit weighty for a podcast and a YouTube channel, but I think the films display this quite beautifully. So this guy called Varlamov films this, what's labeled a documentary that comes out in 1943. And you can find it on YouTube. If you just go and bang in Stalingrad Varlam of 1943, you'll find it. And I don't think you need to understand any of the language in it to get the sense of what it's like. But it's basically formed of 3 parts. It's a 3-act movie. The first act is all of the footage of 1930s, how good life was, this sort of beautiful, elegant, here you can see a boulevard along the Volga, the fresh air blowing in, the markets, how wonderful life is. And then you get this really intense, smoky, dark and bloody battle, right? And they're quite frank about showing the suffering. You'd think that they would want to avoid showing the amount of death that occurred, especially on the Soviet side, but they don't. Because the more you show the suffering, the greater the sacrifice, then the greater the resurrection, right?
Yeah.
And then the last act is all this sort of wonderful geometric grouping of troops marching forward and new constructions just beginning to sort of spring up out of the earth, and light sort of bursts into the shots. It's pretty elementary, but it's well filmed. And much of this work was done actually and was mounted in Central Asia. They decamped the whole Soviet film industry to Central Asia pretty much at the outbreak of the war, and worked from there. And then we get this is I think the most fabulous Stalingrad film that I've seen. The Rebirth of Stalingrad by a guy called Pasielski, I believe Joseph, 1944. So it's the next year, and this is a bit more technologically advanced. They have a bit more time and a bit more budget behind it. And you can sort of see here in the way that I've laid out some of these shots, how they go from the destruction, and they use a plane, right? So that they can film the city from above and show how much it's been squashed. It's an interesting watch. And then they focus really quite quickly on all of this sort of frantic, furious rebuilding efforts. If you've ever seen Dziga Vertov's films from the 1920s, these early Soviet experimental films, it almost feels like them. Everything is whirring and in motion. So you get these people sort of furiously marching down the streets, working along this sort of steel being tempered classical Soviet images. On the right-hand side of the top, I'm sure there's some engineer watching who can tell me what the hell any of that stuff is, but I don't know. But look how bright it is. It gleams, right? You can see, again, if you're an ordinary Soviet looking at this, everything is falling apart still in 1944. People are starving. Repressions are returning by 1944 in a way that just didn't exist in the first half of the war. And yet here something seems to be getting better. And the film, as it moves towards the climax, shows quite a lengthy dance hall scene, right? So suddenly people are able to enjoy it. It's not just about industrial mechanisms, and not just about Stalin, although Stalin suddenly starts to loom larger and larger in the Stalingrad story through the end of the 40s. It is about ordinary people, and you're meant to be able to enjoy it. Last couple of points then, because I think it's interesting. Some of you might have seen or heard of this 2013 Russian film Stalingrad, directed by Fyodor Bondarchuk, and this was Russia's biggest ever domestic movie when it came out, in terms of budget, but also in terms of box office. So people went to see it. It was state-funded mostly. It was a big budget production, very well produced. It's almost like watching a video game. But notice the first shot here on the left of the burning river, the burning city. Do you notice? Did I include it somewhere here? Oh, damn it. I forgot to include it. I was going to. I apologize. It is a shot that is encoded in these very first Stalingrad movies. It comes from one of these very first Stalingrad books, and it is just emblematic. You know, there's sort of, it's almost like crossing the River Styx into the underworld. And that is a reference they occasionally use. So the film's well worth a watch. It's a bit horrific to watch it now when you think about how the Putinist state has created it and how they use Stalingrad today. But it's, you know, if you're interested in the war and understanding what these myths look like to other countries, then this is a good one to watch. And it is watchable. You know, it's well done.
I watched that on the same day. I watched the German Stalingrad from 1993, and then I watched the Soviet Stalingrad, or Russian, from 2013. And as you said earlier, very, very different visions of the same battle. You know, but worth watching kind of back to back like that to get an idea of just, okay, it's cinematic choices, directors, but just the message, that's the wider message being sent.
And Paul, do you happen to remember what happens to the troops in Stalingrad at the end of the movie?
Spoiler alert, I don't think many of them don't survive, do they?
They don't survive. Do you know why they don't survive? Because the hero calls in an airstrike on the house they're defending in order to destroy the Germans who are about to overtake the house. Now, in an American war movie or a British war movie, you have to have one heroic guy who survives the whole war, right? Or survives the battle.
Yeah.
He's sort of victimized, traumatized, maybe, but he emerges somehow. In the Russian narrative, it's not the people who survive, it's the nation who survive. They have to die. They have to be sacrificed. That's the story. But then you get, and this is much later, a much more sort of upsetting version of this in the way that Stalingrad remains relevant for war today, where the Russian state, when you take a city like Mariupol, and Mariupol has been the center of this in the recent war, which is just absolutely flattened by Russian forces. Something like, I believe, 85% of the housing stock was destroyed. 10, 20, 30,000 civilians were killed. There were moments such as this on the left-hand side. This was a theater at the bottom. It says Dieti, which means children. It was bombed anyway. The children are destroyed. All of this in the name of what the Russian state and Russian propagandists are calling the new Stalingrad. And they are making great efforts to show that in Mariupol, new houses are being built. There are fabulous new schools being opened. New life is flourishing. And you can go and look up Russian propaganda videos of like these sort of weird YouTube-y, TikTok-y style videos of people selling real estate about how wonderful your life is going to be in Mariupol, right? And so that tag of the new Stalingrad in this nationalist conception, and I'm not sure how many Russians believe it, but this is what the state is angling for. It's a good thing that the sacrifices happened. It's a good thing that this part of what they label as Russia and these Russians have died, because purportedly they're somehow saving Russia. And it gets quite twisted, right? But it just goes to show that historical memory, World War II, it matters, right? It matters to global politics. It matters to war today in a way that not many other wars do. And with that, I will stop talking, because as I say, I could rabbit on all night about this.
Well, we're thoroughly enjoying it. And, you know, I mean, we've got questions from viewers, but I'm going to go back to what you said about the choice of the word resurrection, because although I'm not religious myself, I understand the Christian faith needed the death of Jesus to have the resurrection. You can't have a resurrection without the death. So is that essentially what we're saying, is that Stalingrad needed to die in order for the resurrection idea to be born out of it?
Yeah, that is the story. It has to happen.
That's fascinating. And my next point, then we'll go to some of the viewer questions, is that if you have a story that is almost from its inception was a propaganda story, then that story can then be tweaked and amended for each successive generation and its particular needs. I'm trying to think of a one came to my head a minute ago about it wasn't Robin Hood. It was something like that gets reused and reframed every few generations for a new audience based on the needs of that. But it's still the same kind of core story. I mean, you see that with some of the kind of Greek mythology stuff, don't you? Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, that kind of thing that gets reframed for a new use.
Yeah, and that is exactly what they're trying to do. And you know what? I sort of skipped what happens after Stalin dies, right? And the answer is that in the 1960s, Stalingrad becomes Volgograd, and suddenly you can literally read books that were reprinted between 1953 and 1965, and they've just taken out every reference to the Battle of Stalingrad, and it's now the Battle of Volgograd or the Battle on the Volga or something similar, right? So they just drop synonyms in and just shift it slightly. And I pointed out with regards to the Planetarium, here's the story being sort of shifting towards the space race and towards a new era.
Yeah.
And then, but one thing that doesn't happen in Russian culture is in the 1990s, where almost everything about Soviet life is debunked to some extent in the 1990s, right? There's this explosion of this sort of wild postmodernist writing, you know, just people tearing myths apart, being playful, being silly, making them ridiculous. silly, parodying them, satirizing them, you name it. But it never happens with Stalingrad. And as part of my PhD work in a part of my life that I'll never get back, but took me a long time, but was quite useful in hindsight, I tried to track down every single work of fiction that's ever been written about Stalingrad in Russian, and I came up with a list of hundreds of books. And I'm pretty confident that the number of these sort of postmodern works that have been produced about Stalingrad is limited to about 4 or 5.
Wow.
Which is wild, right? When everything else about the past is being blown up and torn apart, just doesn't happen.
So it is just part of both Russian history, but Russian mythology, and the boundaries between mythology and history can be manipulated and blurred.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you were to ask Russians what happened at Stalingrad, I'd be pretty willing that to bet that they would give you this story. And there has been some really interesting research by sociologists done over the last few years, not about Stalingrad specifically, but about the war in general, asking people to talk about, what do you identify with the war? What are the most important war stories to you? And also, how do you align yourself politically? Do you think of yourself as very politically engaged? Are you anti-Putinist? Do you trust the state? Or, you can imagine those sorts of questions. And what you'll find is that even people who say, I don't believe what the state tells me, and I don't trust Putin, I don't trust the government, still tend to talk about the war in these very sort of reified, mythical terms. Because it means something on this sort of emotional, affective level that is removed from what we would call history.
I mean, there's lots of things going through my head now. So are we saying that this is pretty much uniquely Russian as opposed to the wider Soviet recollections? Because obviously it is a new world now, but this is a Russian view of Stalingrad.
Well, I'm really trying to be quite careful with the way I choose my words, right? And you will notice that I have really privileged Russian over Soviet, even though most of what I've talked about is in the Soviet era. Now, during the battle, it is very much a joint enterprise.
Yes.
And you will find that there were lots of Muslim characters. There will be a story about an Armenian guy, a Georgian sniper, you name it, they're in there. As soon as the tide turns, 2 things happen. Firstly, Stalin comes back. And there is an excellent book on this by a guy called Jan Plamper, Plamper, who talks about sort of representations of Stalingrad. It's very readable. It's an academic book, but not one of those ones that's sort of densely, impossibly theoretical. And he basically has gone back and charted it. And he's, they didn't mention Stalin throughout the first half of the war. Stalingrad happens November the 19th. Boff, Stalin's back to claim that it was all a genius plan. And the other thing that happens is all of these other nationalities disappear from the story. And suddenly it is Russians who win the battle, because Stalin, even though he is Georgian, wants to paint himself as a Russian. And throughout the rest of the Soviet period, firstly, Russians are primus inter pares. They are the first amongst equals, but also they dominate Stalingrad. They dominate the Stalingrad story. And it is very hard to find books that center non-Russian characters. One of the things that Vasily Grossman did in his great work, Life and Fate. So Grossman had a big falling out with the state. He felt quite guilty over his role in propagandizing for the state during the war. And he wrote one Stalingrad book that was simply called Stalingrad. And a very good translation of it came out a couple of 3 years ago by Robert Chandler, who is Grossman's translator in the West and is a brilliant thinker in his own right. And that was sort of, he managed to get it published in the end, but broadly speaking, it's an officially recognized version of the story. And then in Life and Fate, Grossman decides, no, I'm done with this. I'm going to write what he calls a suicide note. And it just blows apart the story and says, no, this is mythical nonsense. Stalinism is terrible. Soviet stuff is terrible. They're just as bad as the Nazis. And he knows it's never going to get published. The book is smuggled out of the Soviet Union, ultimately published in French in the 1980s, and then an English translation comes, and eventually it appears in Russian, and it's now one of the best known books in Russia about Stalingrad. But in this book, Stalingrad is really torn apart by Grossman, because he says that in these sort of houses that are defended by plucky bands of ordinary Soviets, he picks not Russians, but people with symbolic surnames. So he has a guy called Chekhov, a guy called Grekov, so a Czech, a Greek, and so on and so forth. And the whole story, if you've ever read it, go read it again. And if you haven't, it is hands down, I think, the best novel about World War II. Go look how careful Grossman is to talk about language, how many characters he has speaking different languages. That is all about attacking this idea of Russianness.
And this is where the parallel with the Battle of Britain goes in, because we've talked about on the channel before how in 1940, Pathé and the newspapers were talking about Poles in the pubs and Indian troops marching down Whitehall and all those many nations that were part of the effort, not just in the air, but the defense of the coast and what have you. And then somehow after the war, in various stages, it became Little England only in the skies, and particularly sort of upper classing. And then we kind of come out of that side now to the other, where we're now embracing the Caribbean pilots and the so and so. But every now and then, when it comes up on the channel and we try and debunk the Britain stood alone myth, there'll always be someone in the comments afterwards saying, "But Britain was alone. They absolutely have bought into the Little Englander idea and firmly." And it's important to these people. It's important to them that it's not the colonies defending Britain. It's not Poles. It's not Czechs. It is whatever they have in their mind as the archetypal Englander, and it's England, not British. So there is this parallel I'm seeing with Russia and Stalingrad in that there's in the 80 years since, there's been a need to kind of have this part of it, it's a very Russian story. And yet at the same time, you say the novel you mentioned has the characters. It's complicated, I guess.
Yeah, it's real complicated. But, in Russia or in the Soviet Union, this was wrapped up with ideas about controlling nationalities in particular. Yeah. And this is why many scholars today are trying to explore the Soviet Union as being an imperial construct. This is an empire, and it is not something that is necessarily categorically different from any other empire that's existed in history. Yeah. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but it's a really interesting way to ask questions about the Soviet Union, sort of break apart these relationships between different nationalities, between Moscow and the peripheries.
I want to take you back to the turning point idea and draw attention to a couple of questions that came in, because even before we'd started, people were talking about, is Stalingrad the battle to study if you want to understand urban warfare? That was Major Guru in the Canada was talking about that and things, but now you're saying that there's this more symbolic turning point. So the questions we had Lisa was saying they were riding on patriotism, and Trevor made the very good point about ordinary people can get high on hope and heroes. So are you going as far as saying that it was the propaganda victory of Stalingrad was in many ways more important than the actual defeating of the German Sixth Army aspect of the Battle of Stalingrad?
I don't know if I'd go that far, but what is very interesting, this is going to seem like a bit of a digression, but I think it's important, is for our understanding of what happened at Stalingrad and our understanding of why it was a turning point and why it was important. And, most people who are interested in military history, although it is not all academics agree, would say that this was the turning point of the war, or at least one of the most major turning points of the war. But how do we know about what happened at Stalingrad? Yeah. Well, the answer is that British journalists and foreign journalists were not allowed in the city until after February the 2nd, 1943.
Right.
The first visit happened by Alexander Worth, was the Times correspondent, and I believe he and a group of others were allowed in on February the 4th or February the 5th. And yet Worth was writing reports about Stalingrad throughout the course of the battle. Where was he getting his information? And he was, a fluent Russian speaker. He was of Russian extraction. Well, the answer is he was reading the Russian newspapers, and he was good friends with Ilya Ehrenburg, who was one of the journalists who was writing about it. Right? And if you actually go back and look at what Worth was writing, a lot of the writing closely mirrors what Grossman and Simonov and Ehrenburg were writing. Right? So that's partly where our story comes from. And all of this, I think, matters, because then it is blown up into bigger ways. The king writes to Stalingrad to congratulate Stalin. He writes to Stalin, not to Stalingrad. Pretty soon, it's a few weeks after the battle. I don't remember which month it is. I believe March, but definitely don't quote me on that. That's very sketchy on that. But it's pretty soon afterwards, and you can read it's probably a telegram, not a letter, and it basically parrots this story back again. Stalingrad is the rebirth of civilization. I believe he even used the word civilization in this.
This is interesting stuff. So there's conversation going on a sidebar about the strategy, about the grand picture, and a representative. I'm picking on Ian because he's the message I just happened to see last. So Ian, I'm not asking you to answer this question. I'm saying, should the Germans have outflanked Stalingrad, blah, blah, blah. And these are the kind of same conversations Brits and Americans have about Market Garden. Should Gavin have focused on the bridge, not the Groesbeek Heights, that kind of thing. But would your average Russian person with a sort of an interest in World War II, would they be having those discussions about maybe they could have, brought the victory about earlier? Did the Germans do something wrong? Would they be having those discussions? Would they be having these more wider conversations about the meaning of Stalingrad?
I mean, there is definitely a community of military historians in Russia who have these very sort of intense debates about these points and what could have been, what might have been. But I would say that's broadly not so interesting of a question in Russia. They're much more interested more broadly, and most historians are, and certainly most people in the public and cultural spheres are, in the fact that what did happen did happen. And the significance that seems to have had for the war. And in part, I think this simply comes from this sense that Stalingrad had to happen. Because as soon as you start asking too many questions in public about, well, could it have happened a different way, you start undermining this myth of the sacrifice. Because you say the sacrifice was needless. Maybe it didn't need to have happened. But if you say maybe it didn't need to have happened, then you say, that this isn't that sort of the passion of the Christ that you described to us, Paul. And so, and the state has made this much harder to do in public over the last few years. It's essentially, it is illegal to criticize the state's narratives of what happened during World War II. It is certainly impossible in schools, and it probably was possible in universities just about until a couple of years ago, but certainly not now. I know, for example, the High School of Economics in Moscow was, until recently, one of the better universities. I mean, it was a very good university and was one of the more liberal institutions. They had an excellent World War II history research center that has now been closed down. And now, not everybody has been tossed in jail, but suddenly the funding just somehow disappeared. Oh, we don't have any more money for you. And yet, of course, unlimited money for talking about World War II in many other ways. And lo and behold, about 6 weeks after the closure of that center, another center for World War II study opened somewhere else that was more along the right ideological lines. And other people have gone to jail for talking about World War II in the wrong way. TV Rain was a television station that was viciously attacked for criticizing some of the state stories of what happened during World War II. And things have come very hard. And it means that in terms of getting new information and new research, nobody can do archival research in Russia right now. You can't get to Russia and get information. So it makes things rather hard, and it'll be interesting to see how things go in the next few years.
Oh, I mean, definitely. I mean, even in the years since we spoke, I mean, and I'm speaking to the historians I am, is that just take I'm going to say a simple subject, but a relatively small slither of the Eastern Front, and Lend-Lease. 30 years ago, it would be fashionable to say, of course, the Soviets only did it because of Lend-Lease. Then it was fashionable to say, no, they didn't need Lend-Lease at all. And now it's sort of swinging back to, well, of course, it was only possible with Lend-Lease. And you wonder, where the historiography of that and the opinions will go back and forth over that for a few years. But Trevor Sheehan made a point earlier about, didn't any Russians reflect on how bad things were allowed to become, to have had a battle so far into Russia? But this is your idea about reframing, isn't it? Yeah, the Battle of Stalingrad, as you said, that it was not so much the Soviets won, it was the fact that Germans fucked it up in many ways towards the latter part of it there. But without that gallant battle there, you can't have the resurrection. So have they kind of framed it as a, are there echoes of the miracle of Dunkirk in a sense, in that, you know, that we frame that as the glorious rescue and we needed to have that to do that, but actually it was a defeat?
Yeah, of course, Trevor. People were asking questions, and people were worried very privately, and certainly there are diaries where people are writing about this. But this was where the censorship couldn't take you, right? You couldn't talk about the defeats. And again, if you look at the newspapers, what's very curious about the era of defeats, especially in the first few months of the war, as the Germans approached Moscow up until December 1941, they just don't mention any places. They don't show any maps, right? And so people could kind of figure out, piece together from the newspapers, more or less what was happening. But it was all kind of Aesopian, and you had to puzzle it out for yourself, right? Because the one thing that you can't do is say that Stalin has made an error.
Yeah.
Even though Stalin is pretty desperate by this point.
No, it makes a good point. You make a good point there. So HG made it's a two-part because you can't put too many characters in. He's saying, when I was in Russia in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, people in the World War II Museum there told me for a long time the suffering in Leningrad was not to be exposed in the USSR because it would take away from that. And then there's the next one, the importance of Stalingrad and the Battle of Moscow. Is this something Ian also noticed, that in order to have the Stalingrad Phoenix, you can't have other slightly competing Phoenixes? Is that fair?
Yeah, and I would say the Battle of Moscow was not turned into the Phoenix because they knew it wasn't the end of the war. You know, right. No matter how much you threw propaganda BS at it, it would be really obvious to everybody reading, listening, watching that this was just not what was happening, right?
Yeah.
And they were, you know, the Soviet leaders were not stupid. They were pig-headed. They were obtuse. They were cruel and psychopathic, if you will, but you know, these were not stupid people. They understood how to press people's buttons. Sometimes they were slow to figure it out, like at the beginning of the war. And then Leningrad is an interesting case because in some ways it seems to be like Stalingrad, in that there is a long period of drawn-out suffering and then a victory. But Stalingrad really works because firstly, it's Stalin's city, right? And it has all these 1930s connotations associated with it. And secondly, it really is the military victory. It really is a massive, great triumph, and it's very unexpected. Whereas Leningrad is this slow, drawn-out process of suffering, and then the victory, when it happens, isn't. I mean, it's impressive in a sense, but it doesn't come off with a bang in the way that Stalingrad does.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, do you think? Because you said you started off by saying that the victory there was, in many ways, a surprise, and it's the battle that the Soviets probably should have lost. You know, as we just said, the Germans effectively screwed it up themselves. But do you think, when it is at its darkest moment, do you think there are people in the Soviet machine already thinking in terms of how, if this does go badly, can we still salvage something about this as a PR? If Stalingrad had been completely fallen, could the resurrection myth have been moved somewhere else? Could they have adapted the story somewhere else?
That's something I've wondered. And if you look in this period leading up to November the 19th, from kind of like early October, where the Soviets are really stuck on this tiny little pocket of land, and things are bad, and everybody knows things are bad, and these writers are going off and witnessing slaughter every day, and they're participating in the fighting themselves. You know, they have to pick up guns and do the fighting. There's a great story about Konstantin Simonov that, as far as I'm aware, is true. It was written by a friend of his, that Simonov was going out one day to do some interviews with somebody in some or other defensive location, and they were bombed, and he took to a machine gun and just started having a crack at some planes with some sort of machine gun. So, you know, they're very involved in this. And then if you look in this period, then they're completely wrapped up in this slaughter and violence. They're just really writing increasingly about faith and hope. And they are using both words, right? We, at this point, we just have faith that we're holding on, that the new day will come, that something's going to happen. And they're kind of as surprised as anyone when November the 19th happens and the turning point happens. And you can imagine, having been in that utter sort of bleakness where you think that the world is dying, you're going to die, people around you are dying every day, everything's on fire. Suddenly there is some hope. Of course, you have this great chance to go off and scream from the mountaintop to the entire nation that, you know, things seem different. Would that have happened if Stalingrad was lost? If these people had slinked off from the battle with their tails between their legs, if they'd have died, right? And many of the propagandists did die during the war. I just don't know, and it's something I've puzzled over, but it's one of those impossible questions, and it's tied up very much with what you think would have happened in the grand sweep of the war.
I mean, it's a massive, great rabbit hole in that, you know, we can only assume the Soviet victory would have come even if Stalingrad had been a defeat. It would have just taken longer, and it would have come somewhere else. You know, it's like, I don't know, Kasserine Pass was never going to change the ultimate outcome of what was going to happen in Tunisia, but it was a spot that made a difference at the time. So yeah, it's interesting to know whether a martyr emblem would have worked as well as the sort of the phoenix resurrection emblem, in that a master of propaganda can do something with anything, I suppose, if you spin it the right way. But we're talking about what we can't possibly go.
But hopefully, what you're getting out of this is that this place at this time with these particular people, in the way that things actually did happen, that's the kind of the cocktail of things that comes together to make this particularly powerful. And the state then just absolutely throws itself behind this and sends everyone off to write books and make movies and sing it from the rooftops forevermore.
Brilliant. Well, we'll go back to some of the questions. So you talked about, you know, the novels and the fact that the reporters were from a fiction writing background that made these. You said they were rooted in truth, but they had a literary flair, so to speak. But we had a question very early on: are there any kind of good, I guess he means sort of solid, decent memoirs from the Soviet side about the battle? So ones that aren't by a journalist, that are, you know, a solid, I don't know, an infantry company commander or something like that we have that survive.
That's a good question. There are some interesting memoirs. I'm struggling to think. I haven't looked at them for so long. But you know what? Whoever asked that question, if you send me an email or message me on Twitter, you'll easily find my email on my website. Shoot me a message and I'll look some up for you. That's absolutely fine. And there are some. I'm just not sure how many would be translated in English. That's a fair point. Yeah. Because they had a real period in the 70s when they went bananas about memoirs, and they published hundreds of them. Okay.
This is another kind of almost a personal question to you as a historian. So you've come at this from the propaganda, you've read the Russian sources, but do you have a favorite kind of Western historian? Glantz, Beaver, those kind of people. Is there a go-to that you have regarding either the specifics of the Stalingrad campaign or the wider Eastern Front from a more military point of view? Is there, and maybe not for yourself, but someone to recommend to the audience from your considered point of view?
I'll give you 3 recommendations.
Okay.
How could I pick? From the military history side of things, I mean, Glantz is the absolute don, isn't he? Like, there's no question that he is. It's like his books. I don't know how he managed to produce those, because they're so exemplary and so good. From the understanding what kind of Soviet people were making of this, there is a guy called Johann Hellbeck, Hellbeck, who's based at Rutgers University in the States, although he's German, but I don't know whether he did his education in Germany or not. I suppose it's irrelevant for us. Who has some excellent books. I believe Stalingrad, the City That Defeated the Third Reich, is great. And he also has a book that is about the Stalinist era, like the 1930s, the purges, called Revolution on My Mind, that when I read it, just absolutely blew me away. It's brilliantly incisive stuff about trying to understand really what people make of propaganda and how they absorb it in this day-to-day way, that they're not all raving Stalinist lunatics, and they're not all oppressed and forced into doing it either. They're kind of both at the same time, and he unwraps that really nicely. And then the other book that I just have been rereading lately is there is Erica Fraser, who has a book about women in World War II and kind of the role of the woman soldier around World War II and images of it. She's based in Carleton in Ottawa. So Erica Fraser, you should check out. Really interesting stuff, well written, well researched, and even though it's an academic book, very, very accessible.
Okay, thank you. You kind of addressed this already, but I'll put it to you because Capo asked it twice. Is the Ukrainian and Belarusian pop culture view of Stalingrad different? I mean, you've already answered this with a yes, but is there any particular kind of expansion on that you could give in terms of a long-term view? Obviously, Ukraine right now, Belarus, but have you got an answer to that?
I can't talk about Belarus so much because I simply don't know. Ukraine a little bit, and I would say that there is a real frustration in Ukraine about the fact that Ukrainians have been kind of erased from this victory. The sacrifice of Ukrainians has been written out of World War II more generally. But then at times there are these little moments where the war narrative isn't so roundly criticized. And I don't think that means that Ukrainians buy the sort of Stalingrad as resurrection BS, but there is this sense that Stalingrad is meaningful in some way. And so it'd be really interesting to watch over the next few years if, as I expect, Ukraine continues to go down this sort of post-colonial path of trying to de-Russianize itself.
Yeah.
What World War II memory will look like in maybe, let's say, 15 or 20 years, a generation's time in Ukraine, it could change really, really quickly. All of the things that we've talked about, as we've exposed, that it's all culturally constructed. It comes from not just from propaganda, but from ordinary people as well. But ultimately, if these things are culturally constructed, they can be culturally deconstructed and reconstructed too.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I mean, my next question is really, given your speciality in terms of looking at the propaganda aspect, we talk a lot about historiography and the changing fashions in how we've looked back at certain aspects of World War II and other periods of history. And we're now, we're now firmly in the post people who survived World War II generation, just about. I know there's a few hangers on, but we are really just about closed that door now. So we're now looking at, the objectivity with memoirs. Do you think that people who are coming at the Eastern Front from a traditionally military history point of view, do you think there's necessarily enough understanding of the whole propaganda element of everything that came out of the Soviet Union, World War II? Do they grasp that as well as perhaps they should? When we look at, for example, the memoirs of British or American generals and the field marshals, there's a certain amount of career. They're writing for their careers, but they're not writing from a propaganda machine. They're writing to some extent freely. So do you think military historians sort of are getting that the Soviet Union was a specific type of organization back then and are overlooking how their writing was managed?
What I would say is that war studies as a field, and it is a specific field, it has to be interdisciplinary.
Yeah,
it has to mean that military historians have to read the cultural studies stuff, because you can talk about troop movements all you want, but ultimately, why does somebody pull the trigger on a gun? You can't understand it without the cultural studies stuff, without all this habitus, without all the environment that builds up a willingness to kill for a nation. And you can't understand it without the political studies stuff. You can't understand it without sociology. And likewise, the sociologists of violence and war can't understand it without the military studies or without the military history stuff, right? And so I would only encourage everybody to read much more widely than I think is common. And I think we have a big problem in academic research on war in general, not just on World War II, in that academics are encouraged to be pigeonholed. and encouraged to see themselves as I am just a historian, I am just a literary scholar, I am just a film scholar, rather than saying I study war. And war is something that drives society. War tears things apart, yes, but it also builds up these enormous changes in society like really nothing else. And you have to understand this vast amount of material, or be willing to think about it, or willing to engage with it in some way to understand what's going on. And I always enjoy going to big conferences where military historians pop up and ask me difficult questions about my work and say, have you thought about this? And the answer is often no. I was clueless, right? Because that's not my thing. But the more we ask each other questions, the more we kind of understand how all of this rounds out in practice.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing here, because I get to talk to video game designers, comic book writers, people who write historical fiction, academic historians, popular historians, and we're all coming at this from different directions. But the more, as you say, the more disciplines we can try and bring into our own understanding and reading, the more chance we've got of unraveling that Gordian knot that is trying to make sense of what the fuck World War II was all about. Because I feel that the more I spend reading and doing it, the further I get away from actually understanding the fundamentals of it. It's just an ongoing ordeal, but I kind of enjoy it to some extent. But my last question is going to be really, is Russia going to have Stalingrad in its mythology pretty much forever? Is it going to be the same as, like Thermopylae for Greece or Robin Hood for Brits or what? Is it just around and it will, as we said, it will just be adapted for future generations and future eras for its needs then?
I mean, it's infinitely adaptable, right? It can be repurposed in any way you want. I just earlier this year wrote a paper on sci-fi and like alt history subcultures that are writing like self-published novels about Stalingrad, where basically ordinary sort of emasculated guys fall through the past to refight Stalingrad and therefore become, not post-Soviet sort of disillusioned, disenchanted nobodies. They become great heroes, right? And yet everybody says in the reviews of these books are really true. And, there is something about these books, none of it's true. It doesn't make any sense at all. But there is this deeper truth, this mythological truth. So it shows how adaptable things can be. But do I think it's always going to be this way? As Russia stands today, there is really no force in society that is willing to tear apart these myths of World War II. And the state is pushing very, very hard to re-Stalinize myths of World War II and to bring back Stalin as the sort of the visionary genius who, sure, a few people died, but you got to make tough decisions to win a war, which of course is very convenient given the way that the present war is going, right, where more than a few people have died, but sure, we're going to win in the end. But that doesn't mean it won't go away eventually. If I had to put money on it, I'd say that this is going to continue for a long, long time. But again, 15, 20 years from now, things can unravel really, really quickly.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And I mean, we talk about the mythology that we are aware of, but we're forgetting that obviously other things have dropped away, which is why we're not talking about them, because they stopped being talked about 600 years ago. So we're using confirmation bias, and the ones with examples I'm giving are ones that are still around.
There are parts of the Soviet war myth that died. For example, Brezhnev was associated with this idea of Malaya Zemlya, which is supposedly a place where he'd done some wonderful fighting when he was General Secretary of the Soviet Union. But when he died, everybody stopped mentioning it, and now nobody talks about it. And you could probably ask 100 Russians, 1,000 Russians what Malaya Zemlya was. I bet most of them would not know anything about it. Right.
And that's that we're going back to this idea of that they will know about Stalingrad, but what they know about it might not necessarily be. It's the perennial thing on World War II is that the subjects that are widely known are often the ones that are known. We know the myths. We know what we've been told, and it's when I have a guest on bringing a completely new subject, I have no predetermined conclusions, whereas when it's something like, I don't know, Midway or I've got my ideas, and so sometimes I find out that what I thought I knew is open to interpretation. But yeah, it's but Stalingrad, as you said, every Russian is going to have some kind of response to what does Stalingrad mean to you, and that is essentially what we're talking about. The fact it's still a thing. It's a concept as well as a battle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you, and I love the approach of looking at it from this big wider point of view. And as I said, whether or not some of that architecture was possible, construction technique. If you're watching this and you're an engineer and you think those buildings were possible to be created, then let us know. But it's a fantastic stuff. And Trevor just said, last question: is your dog called Stalingrad?
No, her name is Varia, and she insisted that she had to be here in this room with me.
Was it much better behaved than my cats? I have to lock them in the basement when I'm on, while they'll just come and being arseholes. But anyway, it's fantastic. So, folks, we're looking again tomorrow. Continuing with the series. We're looking at support for the Red Army. So, same time, same place. As always, click like and subscribe. The links to the book are in the description below. Although apparently the American link is not working, I will check that out, and it's probably just been moved in the on the bookshop there. But I'll check that out. But thank you everybody for your questions. Ian, thank you very much for giving me lots to think about, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.